Hi, I'm Marcia Somerville, and I'd like to welcome you to this 5th session of the Master Teacher Series. It's entitled Leading Fruitful Discussions, an Introduction. Now this is very much a part 1 of a 2-part presentation, the combination of which aims at helping you to have more fruitful discussions, no matter what level of discussion you're starting at. As with the other sessions in the series, of the 2 parts, this first one, Session 5, lays the groundwork for the practical how-tos that I'll offer via homework for this session and the content of Session 6. Now, because this is an often requested topic, I anticipate that many of you watching this session will just be joining us in this Master Teacher Series. If you are, can I counsel you to watch the earlier sessions as well? They truly offered significant foundational information upon which this session is built, so this session will make a whole lot more sense to you if you watch those earlier sessions, even if you watch them retroactively. You know, becoming a skilled discussion leader rests on a platform of determination, discipline, and vision for homeschooling. We've spent these earlier sessions looking at why these things matter, and have tried to remind us all that, contrary to the message of our convenience-oriented society, if home teaching is our career, success will most often be won through focused effort, personal sacrifice, and purposeful goal setting. Similarly, the Master Teacher Series aims at helping you to put your precious efforts where they'll do the most good as you continue to improve as a teacher. Our curriculum, Tapestry of Grace, recommends and enables discussions for junior high and senior high students as a major teaching and learning component for worldview studies, as do other programs. Over the last 15 years, we've had many teaching parents contact us with requests for more hand-holding in this area of discussion. Years ago, we produced a webinar that's part of our Tapestry Teacher Training Foundation series on Socratic discussion, and it's been helpful to many. But in crafting this Master Teacher Series, I felt that I needed to focus more efforts on helping teaching parents of all learning levels to feel more confident in leading good discussions, or preparing for them in the case of younger years. It's an area that many feel challenged in, and also that many seem to lack clarity on how to improve. So a question arises immediately. If leading fruitful discussions is so challenging, then why do you include it as the centerpiece approach in your curriculum? Well, I do it because I truly believe that the best single vehicle for shaping worldviews is regular discussion between a mentor who has vision for the worldview that she's trying to shape and the student who's trying to figure out what he believes about God, the universe, and everything, and is probably pretty fuzzy about articulating his half-formed thoughts for the first time. Shaping worldviews is the central goal of Tapestry of Grace over the K-12 experience, and I believe it should be every Christian educator's central goal, as I shared in Session 2 of the Master Teacher Series. Tapestry students study the plot of history and literature as they unfold, but it's in our discussion times that we examine with our students God's plan for mankind, His character, and the failure of all other alternative worldviews as we watch His story unfold together, or talk about the experiments in living that fictional characters undertake and see how those turned out. But you may not be as sure as I am about the importance of discussion. You may be bogged down in the challenges that discussions pose, or even have lost hope that you can improve. So the first section of this talk addresses the question, why do discussions at all? I'm going to go through several reasons why discussions are a powerful tool for education, seeking to offer fresh motivation for those of us who've lost heart or vision for them. I won't gloss over the aspects of discussion that can slow us down, because I believe that identifying these makes them less formidable obstacles. If we can get our hands around them, we can improve. Part of the reason many fail in discussion leading is that they come to them with misplaced goals or expectations. I'm going to hope to help you see that this may be your difficulty. As I taught in Session 1, goal setting, in order to clarify what success would even look like, can really help us to get a handle on a realistic assessment of how we and our students are doing. This session will focus on defining why we do discussions, what properly belongs to the realm of discussion and what doesn't, and then how discussions look in the 2 basic settings that homeschoolers use, one-on-one in homes and in the small group classes of our homeschooling co-ops. Let's talk about why good, mature discussions are powerful teaching tools. First, they're powerful because they require active engagement on the part of the student. This is in contrast to many more passive but traditional forms of learning, such as reading a textbook and going over the questions in the back of the book or listening to a lecture. In discussion, a student has to contribute his or her own thoughts in order for it to flow. Now, this aspect, the participation alone, makes this a powerful learning tool, but there is more. Secondly, with practice and over time, students have to learn and hone a variety of key skills when they regularly participate in fruitful discussions. For older students, discussions require such skills as active listening, logical thinking and argumentation, a command of factual knowledge, and a good use of language. All of these are employed, if you will, on the feet in real time. Third, discussion promotes long-term retention of concepts and information. Students must use, synthesize, internalize, and come to their own opinions of whatever it is you talk over together. Thus, concepts, beliefs, and information move the critical 18 inches from the head to the heart. Now, because discussion is so powerful, many of us really want to use this teaching tool in our homeschools and co-op classes. However, there are things about them that make them challenging for both students and teachers. And so we have trouble sometimes holding fruitful discussions. Now I'm going to discuss some of these obstacles briefly and then go on to give us some good reasons to persevere and learn to perfect this great teaching technique. Let's start with your students. Did you know that discussion can be challenging for them? A difficulty can be that discussions are personal. Student participation demands statements from the student of fact, opinion, and beliefs that the student has to own, yet that can be challenged, and usually are challenged because they're young, inarticulate, and their thoughts are half-formed. While this aspect of discussion presents a real opportunity for homeschooling parents to gain a window into their children's souls, discussion can become an area where students can feel the need for resistance or defensiveness, especially if your parent-child relationships are in any way strained. Parent-teachers can overcome this obstacle by taking care to make the student feel valued and respected for his courage in sharing. I make a habit in co-op classes of thanking students for sharing, whenever they're brave enough to do so. We should also show the student that we understand the substance of what the student is saying, even if we need to challenge it, adjust it, or correct it. Our authority as parents is significant, and sometimes we forget about the weight it carries. Students want to please us, but they also have their own thoughts and beliefs, and again, these are usually only half-formed. Students therefore need space to explore their thoughts aloud in what I'll call a safe zone. When we become discussion leaders, it's important to actively put ourselves as much on par with our students as possible as we, together with them, explore topics through discussion while still retaining leadership. This is part of the art of leading fruitful discussions, and we'll get deeper into this topic in session 6. Now, another difficulty with discussion is that, by comparison with other academic approaches like lectures or Q&A sessions from questions in a teacher's manual, discussions are messy for both the teacher and the student. This is because they don't flow either along linear paths or predictable courses. As teachers and students together look for insights and examine beliefs while exploring information and concepts, the path can get muddled. So the details of good discussions can't be predicted ahead of time, and curriculum authors can't really provide scripts or answer keys. In Tapestry of Grace, we offer discussion outlines, not scripts. We offer questions, and we supply the gist or content that a good student answer should include, but we can't really script a real discussion. As a teacher, you have to choose which questions from the outlines we offer to ask, which to follow up on, and for how long. No matter how detailed or organized a teacher is, as a discussion unfolds, students can ask unexpected questions that take us into uncharted backwaters of subjects for which we feel unprepared. And this can threaten teachers, especially as they're beginning discussions, because again, you might have a fuzzy concept of how a discussion should go. Now, the way to gracefully clear this hurdle is to model a love for learning by admitting that you're out of your depth when it happens, but then offering to find out with the student the answer to his question. This approach frees you from the need to always have the right answer or always know the information, and is a good model for your student. Now, it can also seem to the inexperienced teacher that you're not getting through enough material during the discussion period. Let's talk a bit more about your vision or expectations for fruitful discussions. If your goal is mainly to get through a prepared outline for a class within a set time, you probably will feel consistently frustrated and disappointed, and off balance when it comes to discussions. Because good discussions wander. It's an inescapable part of their nature. But not all who wander are lost. The reason discussions wander is because their nature is to explore topics, not just go over them. It's the difference perhaps between the travels of Lewis and Clark, who first surveyed the uncharted West in the early 1800s via a 4-year excursion from coast to coast, and the traveler at the end of the same century who took a train from Boston to Los Angeles in a few days. Lewis and Clark were exploring. They had a general direction, but not a railway track or an engineer to drive them. It took them longer, but they sure were more intimate with the land than that high-speed traveler was. Both traveled from east to west, but which had the more rich, varied, and intimate experience? As we'll discuss in a few minutes in detail, a teacher's job is more to keep the discussion on a few meaningful topics that lead to discovery and internalization than to make sure that pre-planned outlines are followed or that all the information is covered. Here perhaps is a useful measure of success with discussion. Typically, a fruitful discussion goes deep, not wide. For instance, a fruitful hour-long discussion would cover one question about George Washington's leadership qualities and relate them to the student's understanding of leadership, rather than go over all the factual information about Washington's life and times during that same hour. In a few minutes, I'll explain more about why this is so. Now, this shift in focus from covering or reinforcing or cementing information to exploring concepts and beliefs can be very liberating. Part of the shift involves learning first to trust that as your student becomes a fluent reader, he really can internalize information from what he reads independently. And second, to realize that your role as a discussion leader as your child gets older is not to reinforce his reading comprehension or enhance his memorization efforts, but to explore concepts, beliefs, and categories. And as we turn from reinforcement to exploration as the core model for discussions, even though it's messy, we do have reassurance that we're covering the right things, even as we're picking and choosing what to cover. First, this is true because Christian teachers can rely on God within the messiness. The Holy Spirit is present to guide us to cover what's most important in our limited hours for discussion. We're never going to cover it all. But there's a peace that comes from knowing that God is sovereign over the topics and the amount of material that we cover. And this reliance upon God really reinforces our true dependence on Him for all of our parenting and teaching. You know, there's just truly so many moving parts to a discussion that no one can fully domesticate them, nor should we try. To become comfortable with the squishy edges and deep waters of the discussion pool can take time and effort, though, for both teachers and students. So give yourself time, space, and grace to grow in this discipline. Now, something else that helps with choosing questions and topics for discussion with confidence is being well prepared. However, on the flip side, this can also be another obstacle for homeschooling parents, since finding time to adequately prepare can be challenging. As we've noted in the Master Teacher Course Session 3, personal preparation is so important to all masterful teaching, and leading fruitful discussions depends on it. Why? Well, when a lack of adequate preparation and the messiness of a discussion join up, teachers can find themselves vaguely groping along, asking questions of students that maybe the curriculum authors have penned, but that they're not really equipped to explore. It's easy to understand why such teachers would lose confidence as they go. Students who are not adequately prepared, who haven't done the reading, or who haven't answered preparation questions, will often sit mute in response to a discussion prompt, or maybe give a half guess at the answer that they think the teacher wants. Especially if they've come from a textbook Q&A session approach, they won't enjoy the process because they won't know exactly what's expected of them. It's going to take some time to train them into the exploration model of a fruitful discussion. In producing Tapestry of Grace, I wanted to promote discussion as a teaching technique, but from personal experience with raising and homeschooling 6 kids, I also knew that parents are busy. We have a lot to manage, as we discussed in session 3, and so this is a challenge to fruitful discussion leading, and it can be a tough one. This is why Tapestry offers significant helps for discussion preparation for both the teacher and the student. We offer our teachers background information and discussion outlines in their teacher's notes. These help them to prepare as efficiently as possible. Students are assigned to do independent reading that gives them information that they'll discuss, and we offer you, the parent, the choice to assign follow-up accountability and thinking questions for that reading that are designed to help them form opening opinions and prime the pump for the discussion with you. But even with these aids, there's simply no substitute for coming up to speed on the basic facts that will be the bedrock of your discussion content. The good news for Tapestry users is that the significant effort to understand the flow of events in God's story during your first rotation through the program pays dividends in successive rotations. If you apply yourself, say, to a somewhat thorough study of ancient Egypt with your grammar stage children in the early years that do seem so busy, as you come back to it 4 years later, you're going to find that much of what you studied about Egypt stuck with you, and that a quick review will enable you to hold discussions with your now older student that are quite fruitful. The stuff of history and literature really will get more and more familiar to you as you go over it, and your sense of confidence will grow even as the time that you need to devote to personal preparation on these disciplines diminishes. Furthermore, as we'll cover in detail in session 6, what we do with younger children for what we call discussion is better termed narration. We ask leading questions that help young children to verbalize the plots of stories that they read in history and literature. We do this for reinforcement, comprehension checks, and practice with putting their thoughts into words. So in the early years, these are really pre-discussion exercises. The joy for you as a teacher is that doing these with your kids not only helps them with memory retention, but it's both less demanding of us than a mature discussion, and helps us to remember the details of the stories of history and literature as well. Later, when we begin to pick and choose categories and concepts for more mature discussions with our then older children, we'll have this history learned, as well as habits of verbal interchanges with our children built. Again, more on this in session 6. If you're watching this, you probably agree that you need to do personal preparation, but you still might consciously or unconsciously be looking for that silver bullet of a how-to that makes success instant. You know, I really don't know of one, so I don't think it would be kind to give you the hope of finding one. While some curriculum programs offer simple steps to follow, the question for me to ask would be yes, but what results do you get if you follow those simple steps? I truly believe that discussions can't be scripted, but that they are powerful teaching tools. So let me again encourage you, find a time slot in your weekly rhythms to prepare for your discussions, if this has been a weak point for you. You'll feel increasingly confident if you do, and I'm betting that your student will be increasingly responsive as well, especially if your student, too, needs to do more personal preparation than you've been requiring of him or her hitherto. I can state with conviction that improvement as needed in this one area will certainly make your discussions more fruitful. In fact, with good preparation done by teachers and students, mutual interests can quickly take both of you into details, digressions, discoveries, and delights that neither anticipated when the discussion time began. I have loved hearing stories over the years from Tapestry parents about how delighted they are to be going to school themselves as they explore history with their older students using Tapestry materials. Discussions can become the central delight of each week's studies. It has been so in our family and in our local co-ops. This is because true discussion necessitates active thinking, open questioning, and sharing opinions. So fruitful discussion can come to be some of the most productive, enjoyable, faith-enhancing, and parent-child relationship-building times of the week. And best of all, discussion produces thinkers who can unlock any discipline via questions that they learn to ask of themselves and others. This is our core, long-term educational strategy and will be the central topic of Session 6. I want to enliven you to the idea that we teachers ask good, deep, thought-provoking questions of our students for the purpose of modeling. Over time, by asking similar questions week after week of the material at hand, we train our students to ask these exact same deep, thought-provoking questions of themselves and others after they leave our home. By such means, they can learn about and think clearly about any topic that comes their way. Discussion is therefore really an art, as is conversation. The give and take, the acceptance of opposing views and gray areas, the awkward silences, the challenges to false statements, the sudden flashes of insight or truth, these are possible during any discussion and should be welcomed as parts of the whole. They simply go with the territory. Becoming comfortable with these elements of discussion and learning not only to field them, but to promote them for the good of all is the goal of the good discussion leader. And for those of us who like statistics, in Love the Journey, Chapter 24 starts with this information, which can be quite motivational. It says there that learners retain approximately 90% of what they learn when they teach someone else or use immediately the information. They retain 75% of what they learn when they practice what they learned, 50% when they engage in group discussion, 30% when they see it in a demonstration, 20% of what they learn from audiovisual, 10% of what they learn when they learned from reading independently, and 5% of what they learn when they've learned from a lecture. As a parent devoted to shaping my students' worldviews, I've found that discussions are worth it. In fact, there's nothing that touches them for overall effectiveness. Properly employed in academic settings, discussions hone key skills that support further education, social interactions, and eventually, vocational effectiveness. You know, that 50% number on this list is for a group discussion. And I've found that in smaller groups where students must talk more, such as are most frequently found in homeschooling co-ops, virtual online classes, and one-on-one discussions in home academies, students are using what they've learned and trying to explain or teach others about what they believe or know. So that's the 90% figure here. Thus, I believe that especially in the upper grades, our home-based discussions can raise that 50% retention figure even higher. Now let's say that you agree that discussions are valuable components of both individual and group learning. The question many of you now have is, how do I lead better discussions? Well, let me just say up front that this topic of discussion leadership is huge, and so is this question. There is no one, right, quick and easy, add water and stir answer, because there's a host of variables involved. And we can't fully answer this question in an hour or 6 hours, which is why this session has the title An Introduction and why we have up Part 2, Session 6, Asking Good Questions. That said, I believe that we can together clarify some universally experienced problems with getting discussions off the ground that have to do with our goals and are specific to our unique setting, discussions in homeschool contexts. I can then offer some directions for you to head as you go off to do your homework and go on to Session 6. So let me just detail this plan for Sessions 5 and 6 for you. Because it's a huge topic, we need to keep our focus tight. So let me spell out the plan for this session and also preview the next one, since the two together really make up Part 1 and Part 2 of my attempt to help you tackle this big subject. And let me also add that we do plan to offer even more in-depth elective master teacher sessions, some of them live, in the future. So again, these two core sessions are intended as the beginning aids for you as you grow in this area. So let me start with defining the problem for you that I'm going to address in this session. As parents who have had no formal training in leading academic discussions, we can often feel that we and our kids are floundering, but we don't know exactly why. I find that lack of ability to improve our discussions often arises from two main obstacles. First, because many teaching parents have unclear visions, goals, and purposes for their discussion They can aim too high or too low, or miss the mark altogether and end up feeling like failures and get discouraged. We need to better understand what we're aiming at before we can amend how we get there, and that's what this session will focus on. Secondly, teaching homeschool parents have lacked basic how-to resources on this subject. In working to put this session together, I reviewed over a dozen such resources, looking for one to assign as an aid to you for homework. Do you know, I ended up rejecting all but one of these resources. Either they were geared towards traditional classrooms, some of them at the college level that typically had 20 or 30 students, or they got way too technical too fast, using a lot of secular eduspeak that really didn't serve the Christian homeschooler well. Or they went off on a pet theme or approach or application of discussion that often required an inordinate amount of preparation for both teachers and students. I got pretty discouraged, but the good news is that I did find one excellent resource for you, and I'll be sharing in more depth about how best to access and use it as I end this session and assign homework. So in a way, I've taken care of this second obstacle, and I've done it through the homework, which will actually be a prerequisite to complete before you view session 6. So let me return to problem number 1, which is clarifying goals and expectations, so we're at least aiming our efforts in the right direction. Here's what we'll cover during the rest of session 5. I'd like to help you crystallize your vision for what you're trying to achieve when you set out to have a discussion. So first, we'll clearly define what we're talking about when we use the term discussion. And second, we'll go into some detail on the factors that make discussion goals different when we're in group settings versus home academy ones. My working hypothesis is, if you're accurate in setting reasonable goals for your discussion times, you'll be more confident in carrying them out and in accurately assessing how you and your students are doing. This much success will, I hope, encourage you to invest more and more in discussions, which will then yield even higher harvests of fruitfulness in an upward cycle. And in session 6, we'll be focused on the actual content of discussions of various types. We'll look at the kinds of questions we ask, the rhythm with which we ask them, and what should be our focused purpose in asking them, especially in relationship to the 3 learning levels that we as moms serve during our K-12 teaching careers. Okay, so let's move into section 3, defining our terms. This section may seem to run long to you, so I'm going to start up front with why I'm taking the time to closely define what discussion is and is not. I'm doing this simply because many untrained parents are aiming their efforts in the wrong direction. What they think of as discussion is not what we mean by the powerful worldview-shaping, thinker-producing method that we're trying to hone. So let's take an in-depth look and see if you've got a good working definition for yourself, or if it needs refining. Before I start, I'd like you to pause this tape for a moment and write down your definition of what a discussion is. Okay, thanks for doing that. What is discussion? Did you find that it's not as easy to define the term as you might first think? I'm going to start by contrasting discussion with what it isn't. Discussions are not lectures. Lectures have their uses, but not within discussions, unless it becomes necessary to bolster a student's bank of useful facts. A lecture, by definition, is a teaching session given typically before a live audience that seeks to impart information. So, a sermon is a lecture. And many traditional classes, live and online, employ lecturing as their main information transfer genre. This that you're undergoing right now is a lecture. Typically, the lecturer is an expert in his field, or at the very least, he or she carries the authority of an expert. Presumably, the lecturer has picked out key information and arranged it for easy importation by students via their ears, and possibly their eyes if, like this one, it's an audiovisual lecture. During a lecture, the audience, or the student, listens, and it's up to the listener how actively he listens. Generally, learning via lecture is considered passive learning, and retention rates for what's learned are ranked near the bottom, as we noted earlier. So that's lectures. Now, another thing that a discussion isn't is it's not just a conversation. The dictionary definition of a conversation is, quote, informal interchange of thoughts, information, etc. by spoken words. oral communication between persons, talk, colloquy, end quote. In a conversation, of course, there are two sides, and when we use this word, we typically mean a back and forth that includes a sense of wandering or aimlessness. Many don't have a purpose in view when they begin to converse. Examples of this are dinner time conversations, car ride conversations, or party conversations. There are many people, though, such as parents, for instance, or businessmen who might say, "I'm going to have a conversation with you about your messy room," or about your performance last month. Now, such conversations may be a bit one-sided, less an exchange and more like a lecture. Let's turn to the term dialogue, used as a noun. The dictionary says that it is, quote, an exchange of ideas or opinions on a particular issue, especially a political or religious issue, with a view towards reaching an amicable agreement or settlement, end quote. We hear this word used often in the context of diplomacy. In fact, in my lifetime, this noun has become a verb. You'd hear something like, the president is dialoguing with the British Prime Minister and trying to negotiate an arms agreement, for instance. Some dictionaries list discussion as a synonym for this word, but it is distinct, and I'm going to go into details in just a minute. Quickly, though, let's look at the word debate. Debate is, first, a discussion as of a public question in an assembly involving opposing viewpoints, a debate in the Senate on farm price supports. 2, a formal contest in which the affirmative and negative sides of a proposition are advocated by opposing speakers. 3, deliberation, consideration. 4, strife or contention. I include this last definition even though it's archaic because it makes for me an important point. Debates involve an examination of a topic through a contest. Two sides take set opinions and try to argue an audience into believing their side, which they hold against all comers and against all facts to the contrary. So very well, we've said all of these things that discussions aren't. Now, I want to quickly state that they can employ elements of all of these terms that I've just detailed. But none of these terms fully comprehends what we mean by the term discussion in our context. The dictionary defines the word discussion as the examination or consideration of a matter in speech or writing. I think that this is a key point for us to grasp. Discussions are, or should be, explorations that the teacher and student make together. From this assertion flows several important distinctions. Discussions are different from lectures in at least 3 ways. First, in discussion, though the teacher is at least a moderator and at the most a mentor, she's not the authority in the same manner as the lecturer is. This should come as a vast relief to many of us. The idea that we're not meant to know all the answers that the discussion questions might raise should free a good many of us from the intolerable burden of having to be right or in the know for all possible avenues of discussion. It speaks to that messiness issue that we discussed earlier. Also in discussion, unlike a lecture, the goal is not to follow a linear, logically arranged path. In a lecture, the teacher arranges the facts and information in a straight, logical series. A very tidy, manageable arrangement that's easy for the listener to follow. Discussions don't have this tidiness, as we've already talked about, nor will they ever. To seek such order and linear direction within discussions is to stifle them to death. So this is another reason why lectures are not discussions. They're not the same animal. Lectures are also one-way streets. As I mentioned earlier, discussions, by contrast, involve the student as actively as the teacher. It is this active participation that makes them so effective in terms of long-term retention. And there are details about this factor that I'll go into later in this session. Now let's go back to that word conversation and differentiate. In our specific venue, that of academics in the homeschool setting, we're actively seeking to make Christian disciples. So there's a purposefulness to discussion that isn't present when we mostly call things a conversation. I think that sometimes homeschool teachers fail to take a directive mentoring role because they feel like it has to be a co-equal conversation. This is sort of a balancing act or a knife edge on which we teachers as homeschooling parents walk. And that's what makes it more of an art and a skill than it might otherwise be. So even though it's not just a conversation, the skills that are vital for the verbal back and forth nature of conversations are also essential to good discussions. We'll be going into more detail on these later, but I'll summarize them here. Good conversations involve active listening. Good conversation involves clear thinking. Ideally, conversationalists know what they're talking about, so some command of good facts plays into a good conversation. And good conversations also involve the ability of participants to express themselves in words, and to assemble those words in real time. This stands in contrast to written arguments or statements, for instance, or again to lectures, which can be more crafted and more linear. Generally speaking, as teachers of young adults, we should not look for a polished, whole, or even at times cogent verbal communication when deep conversations or discussions are afoot. Now let's go back to that term dialogue. This is perhaps the hardest to differentiate. In fact, most discussions with our high schoolers will take the form of a Socratic dialogue. Remember, the definition we identified was an exchange of ideas or opinions on a particular issue, especially a political or religious issue, with a view towards reaching an amicable agreement or settlement. Well, this gives the idea of working together toward a settlement among equals. The main differentiation in our setting to be made here is that we are teachers, and as such we are directing the discussion with an end purpose in mind. We want students to express their thoughts and beliefs, so that together we can examine, challenge, and adjust them. Thus, in the homeschool discussion, even in the 11th and 12th grade, it's not exactly an exchange of ideas or opinions among equal, quote, with a view towards reaching an amicable agreement or settlement, end quote, or without reference to a higher authority. By just this much can we make the distinction between a discussion and a dialogue. As we'll discuss in Session 6, this is a mighty fine line to tread, because we do explore, but we also direct. Finally, let's look at the word debate. Again, though at times debates are sub-segments of discussions, the overall goal of a discussion is to explore, not to wrangle. In discussion, there's a sense of helping one another along, rather than seeking to knock one another over, as with debate. In discussions, we try to examine beliefs and arguments to see if they're true, not in order to prove our opposing assertions as we stick to them, defending them, come what may. If we use the analogy of a game of cards for a moment, we play the discussion game with, if you will, open hands. All cards are on the table in a discussion. Not so with a debate. Cards are closely held and strategically played in debate, and trump cards are held most closely until the moment when they are triumphantly produced for the win. Now those are our clarifications for the words which sometimes confuse parents who are seeking to hone discussion skills. If you're taking this session for certification, on your Moodle interface you'll find a written copy of all that I just said that you can print or view online, and then you can mull it over to make sure that you've got a good working definition of discussion for yourself that will properly shape your goals and thus your workflow. Let me also highlight one more key definition before we move on from this section. What most often passes for discussion in both traditional classrooms and in homeschools is what I'll call question and answer sessions, or I've deemed it educational ping pong. Class time is spent going over content that was assigned as independent reading in order to check comprehension or retention of the information. Now, note well that goal. It's to check on and to hopefully solidify the retention of information that was taken in passively by the student. In some cases also, the goal is to pick out what's important to the teacher in the independent reading so that it can later be tested for. This aspect leads many students to study to the test rather than seeking to learn the content for its own sake. Students are trained by this Q&A approach in traditional classrooms to retrieve the, quote, right answer, but not to put it into context or internalize it. What they learn doesn't become part of them in that they own it for themselves. It just becomes something that they know and can repeat on cue. Thus, they can tell you the answer to the question, who was George Washington? That he was a great leader, the father of our country. But ask, what made him a great leader? Or, did he have struggles in leading? Or, why should we care if he did struggle as a leader? Or, does George Washington's life and leadership shed any light on your life and how you should lead? Students, when asked these questions, can give blank looks and fall silent. They don't connect the lessons of Washington's life with their own lives, and over time, they forget what little information they've learned in order to pass the test. Educational ping pong will never make information relevant to our kids. Yet, kids have questions like the ones I just asked, or they should have them, if they're thinking. Let me ask you this. Which end of the pencil is the learning end, and why? It's the eraser. You write what you know, or think you do, with the lead end. You erase when you revise your thinking, or when you learn something new. It's in thinking about information, asking and answering thinking questions, not factual ones, that learning occurs. We have different terms for such learning that are all in operation during a real, mature discussion, but seldom come into play during games of educational ping pong. Consider these learning or thinking words. Internalizing comes when I try to answer questions like, what do I think of this really? Do I believe what I'm being told here for myself? What questions do I have about this concept or information? Where does this concept or information intersect with my real life? Vocalizing is another learning term. This is taking a stab at expressing one's thoughts about a question at hand. To do so, one must assemble one's thoughts and then retrieve words that communicate them to someone else. As one actively participates in a discussion, one owns what's expressed in a new and real way. And like that eraser, discussion involves learning through refining thoughts. The verbal statement that I make opens up what I think to others and to myself. Often I want to take words back, restate, reorganize, or just chuck my opening statement altogether. As I refine, I use, remember, and come to own concepts and information. Learning involves movement. It's active. When I discuss ideas or information, I'm advancing in that I better know both the information that I've been engaged with and what I think in connection with it. I also find that I want to think or talk more about this so that I can learn more and understand better what I and others are thinking about it. Through discussions, learning is kept interesting because thinking and active expression and ownership of ideas and information equal interest. By contrast, listening to what someone else thinks, listening to someone else talk on and on about what they think, usually that adds up to boredom, disinterest, and a lack of active participation in the learning process. Now let's go to our last section for this presentation. We looked hard at what discussion is and isn't, and looked at what we can achieve through using it toward the goal of educating our sons and daughters to be thinkers. I want to now note the different strengths and weaknesses that homeschoolers, as distinct from traditional school teachers, encounter in the two most common discussion contexts, small group and one-on-one discussion. My goal here again is to help you to clarify and make realistic your vision for discussions so that you can put your energies to good use and your discussions can be as fruitful as possible. Now let's take up discussion in group classes. Now, I'm thinking in group classes of anywhere from 4 to 20 students led by one teacher. Group teaching via co-ops on the ground and virtual classes via the internet are more and more common, though a majority of homeschoolers discuss most subjects in their home academies still, and also, in most co-ops, groups are more like 4 to 10 than 4 to 20. In such a small group class, students can learn from one another's input. That's the key difference. Individuals come with varying degrees of internalized information and have differing viewpoints to contribute. Also, classmates become mirrors for the individual student. While a student may not accept the opinions, information, or feedback of teachers, fellow students usually make a deep impression, often because the student compares himself more readily with peers than with adults. In groups, a teacher is able to be more of a facilitator than a participant, though entering into explorations with students while retaining control is certainly desirable. Another aspect is that group discussions can be changed up more easily. For instance, a teacher might assign a small team of students within the group to report information to the group before the discussion starts, or she might tell the group to pair off and share their impressions of the first half of the discussion, and then continue with it after that's done. So these are some of the opportunities and advantage of small group classes. Now, a downside to group discussions is that the unprepared students can really drag down the entire class. Typically, a teacher must teach to the least prepared student present so as not to leave him or her behind. Also, larger groups take longer to discuss any given topic because the teacher wants to give every student a chance to contribute. Furthermore, each individual student talks for only a fraction of the discussion compared to the solo student at home who can talk for half to 3/4 of the discussion time. This also means that the student in a larger group can get away with being unprepared more readily than can the solo student at home. Finally, the teacher of a large group spends more energy in making sure that the discussion remains on point and in moderating between talkative and quiet students so that a good balance of sharing is achieved. This is part of the skill of being a good discussion leader of group classes. Now, let's look at discussion in home academies. I'm now discussing the common case of a mother or father sitting with one student or possibly two, if on the same learning level, who are their own children. Such single students have no variety of classmates to provide either input or mirrors. For younger students, this isn't a problem, but the older the student gets, the harder the teaching parent will need to work. Parents leading one-on-one discussions must take extra care to listen well to, respect, and encourage individual students while still offering fair challenges to their assertions. Parents need to offer their own opinions as fellow travelers, not as final authorities, and give students the right to question, to consider, and even to reject their statements as a starting place. Most parents who allow room for this will find that as they discuss a matter evenly and without a lot of emotion, the student will come to see errors much more easily because they won't feel like they need to entrench themselves in a debate in order to prove their ability to believe whatever they want to believe in their own way. It can be a tough dynamic at first as your student grows into these dialectic years because it can threaten our desires for our children to know the truth as we see it. And because, being people, we can take the rejection of our ideas as a personal rejection. Yet, fruitful discussion with young adults hinges greatly on this dynamic. In all discussions, teaching parents still retain the authority and that mentor role, but we need to take care to both guide the discussion and allow the student room to ponder, to reflect, to misstate, to revise, and to question without taking these things personally or quashing emerging ideas. This balance can be so difficult to maintain, especially at first, and I'll be talking more about it in section 6 when we dive into the topic of asking good questions. For now, I'll just say that in order for a true, mature discussion to take place, by which I mean an exploration, as normally happens in junior and senior high classes, both the teacher and the student will need to explore the topic together. This means that both the teacher and the student must prepare ahead by learning the basic facts or concepts that will be discussed. Both need to know enough to have formed some opinions about the question at hand. And here we have again the value of doing the hard personal preparation work thoroughly in the younger years so that you can reap the benefits of knowing your stuff time and again as you discuss history and literature with multiple children multiple times. So the home academy teacher who's doing solo discussions needs to have an idea of where she wants to take the student, which will in turn depend on the student's learning level, as we'll see in session 6. And again, with Tapestry of Grace, we offer teachers directions that they can take up at their discretion, choosing among questions that are listed in the teacher's notes discussion outlines. Now please note that the main purpose for our discussion outlines is not to offer support for the Q&A educational ping-pong, but to give a spectrum of questions from which you can choose, along with a gist of sample answers that the student might be expected to give from their readings. Such sample answers are given in italics, if the content of the sample answer was given in the student independent reading. If the sample answer is printed in non-italics regular font, it indicates that the teacher might want to give this information to the student in a brief lecture format or supply it as information as part of the discussion that you're having. These outlines were written to give many of our teachers a sense of direction or a goal for what they want to guide their students to see by the end of the discussion. A benefit that the solo student enjoys is that they get more chance to talk during the discussion, and it's in the talking that the thinking happens. The student thus gets a chance to state, revise, and refine his ideas and beliefs. A benefit for the teacher is that the discussion can be shorter and more pithy, or, conversely, you can go long and use the time allotted by the curriculum to go far deeper into subjects as the Spirit directs than with a larger group of students. Also, the teacher of the solo student doesn't need to be concerned with balancing talkers with quieter students or ferreting out those students who aren't prepared. However, such a teacher does need to be aware of the need for and the value of pauses and silences in the course of a fruitful discussion. Like that eraser, it is often true that in silences, which can be uncomfortable for teachers, are found the deepest context for real thinking in the student. We'll go into this topic more in Session 6. And speaking of Session 6, I'm going to leave this session here and ask you to do some homework. Then you should come back and view Session 6, where we're going to get very practical now that we've laid a sufficient foundation. So here are your homework assignments. Number 1, you should review this session with your own unique situation in mind. Go over the points that I've made fairly rapidly, and then write out answers to the following questions. How would I define my goals and expectations for the discussions I hold currently? Fair warning, your answer may change considerably after you view Session 6, but that's okay. The purpose here is to get you clarifying the ends that you have in mind in your homeschool. Second question. Has this session shown me any specific ways that I need to adjust those goals and expectations that I held coming into it? Again, be specific. If you've seen areas to improve, great. It's good to see it, but no actual improvement has occurred. You now need to make a plan for how you'll make substantive changes. And your SMART goal chart may be a helpful tool for this. Here's another question. How am I doing in the way of investing in personal preparation for my discussion times? Grade yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 low, 10 high. How faithful, diligent, and active are you in preparing for your discussions before you have them? Here's another question. Am I requiring enough personal preparation before discussions of my students? Okay, those questions are meant to help you apply what you've just heard to your personal, unique setting. Now, after you've done that, here are the video resources that I found and now recommend that you view before watching Session 6. Happily for us, they're free. If you've purchased and are watching just this session, you'll need to copy these URLs on the slide down by hand. If you're taking the course for certification, you can print a handout from your Moodle interface and/or simply click on the links that are mounted there and watch from there. I want to make a few points of clarification as some of you are copying down these links. First, the organization that provides these videos, criticalthinking.org, is a secular organization, and so some of their statements and goals may need to be modified by you as you listen to their videos. Secondly, this organization makes printed guides for teachers on all learning levels, but the videos that I linked here are more specifically for older students, late junior high and high schoolers. This doesn't mean that if you only have littles at home, you should not watch these videos. But neither does it mean that if you only have littles, you should seek to apply this material to them exactly as it's presented. So why am I asking you to watch them? Someday your little ones will be bigger. In Session 6, I'm going to give you quite a bit of specific direction on pre-discussion exercises and activities that can and should be undertaken in the younger years. If you watch these videos and gain vision for where you're headed someday, you'll have a better understanding of the reasons why you should do the pre-discussion work while your kids are little. Finally, if you want to explore the printed resources for youngers, middles, or olders, they are available in PDF for free on this same website, criticalthinking.org. You can view and print them from these URLs, which I'll put up on the screen and leave here for you to copy down in case this is the only session you're viewing. Thanks so much for watching through this with me. Thanks so much for investing in your homeschool and your children as a career woman who seeks to better herself for the sake of her family. Until we talk again in Session 6, may you feel the strength and blessing that come from God as you seek to please Him in your endeavors to improve and become a master teacher.